Thank you. Well, kia ora tato, and it's a great pleasure to be with you all this evening. And as I was just saying to Chris, I'm disappointed not to be down in the Wire Wrapper. I was very much looking forward to coming for a visit. And but this, of course, is a very handy partial substitute. So thank you for joining us this evening. And I just want to reassure Alex and anybody else who is going to be at the Combined Council meeting tomorrow. Don't worry, I've got essentially a whole new presentation for you tomorrow, and the two do dovetail together. I will make sure that everybody at the council meeting tomorrow has both presentations, so that you've got the benefit of those. Now, I'm got some slides to show, and I'll try and keep that to about 30 or 40 minutes. These slides have quite a lot of quite a few words on each of them, and also links to places you can go and find more. I'm not going to talk to all of the slides. I just set up slides that way so the presentation is easy to follow when somebody goes back and looks at it. So when you do see lots of words on the screen, don't worry too much about that. I will just be sort of stepping through the slides and giving you the essence of each. And Chris, I'm sure we can find some way to make the I'm sorry, we should have thought about that before we came on air, to make the PDF of tonight's presentation available to people, but you and I can work that out later. I'm just going to, first of all, share my screen, and then I'm going to just start up my presentation here, and then we'll be all set. There we go. I want to talk, if I may, about how the COVID pandemic will hopefully help us to right some systemic wrongs. And I'm going to focus on two of them in particular, inequality and the question of climate justice. And actually, the two are linked and in an important way. I also like a rather more shorthand title. So I thought of Regeneration Trumps Recovery. So recovery is just getting us back to where we were, which clearly isn't good enough because we weren't in a terrific place before COVID. But regeneration is a word that we're starting to use in all kinds of fields. And it's such a lovely word about regrowth, growing anew, repairing or replacing what's been damaged, in biological terms even, let alone in others. So regeneration is a fine word. And the word trumps I'm using entirely as a verb here, borrowing from cards about playing the trump card, in terms of this idea that this card, the regeneration card, is the powerful one to play. So as I just said, recovery is very much about only getting us back to where we were pre-pandemic. And of course, that's about deep unsustainability, deep inequality, deep economic fragility for all. Whereas regenerate is about creating anew and righting those wrongs and living better with each other and this living planet. But in order to do that, we need to relish complexity. Not just COVID, but all these other intersecting issues are fiendishly complicated. And we're actually learning a lot in the COVID pandemic about how to deal with that complexity of a very fast changing nature. And I hope that that's going to give us confidence to move on and relish dealing with complexity in other ways. We've also got to revel in ambition, because what we need to do is big, and we mustn't resile from that. We must embrace that ambition. But above all, we need to learn enough so that we can act with confidence in this. And again, when I come on to talk about the virus in due course, that's been a very important theme. But let me just start with this bit of a precursor because it's so fundamental to everything that we need to do. This is the view of our home, our blue marble, from the barren, rocky, nearest neighbor, the moon. That little blue strip is the atmosphere on which all life on this planet depends, and it's in totality relatively deep, 500 kilometers. But of course, almost all the air we have is in that first 10 kilometers, and it's an extraordinary, extraordinary thin layer of atmosphere that supports, or is one of the supports of life on the planet. And yet, into that thin layer, we pumped some 37 billion tons of CO2 equivalents into the air last year, and of course only exacerbating the climate crisis which is underway. There's a much bigger context though, and it's about the Great Acceleration. This was a term coined now over a decade ago by scientists at the Stockholm Resilience Centre. And they looked, first of all, at socio-economic trends from 1750 or so, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. But on all those charts, you'll see a dotted line running down, and that's 1950. And so from about 1950, we got this extraordinary acceleration in population, in economic activity, in urban population, in energy use, in fertilizer consumption, water, transportation. And of course, very important to us down the bottom is the most astonishing surge in international tourism. And we have grown our tourism here in New Zealand far faster in those decades than tourism internationally. But all of those socioeconomic trends had this enormous impact on Earth system trends, whether it's the greenhouse gases across the top, or the temperatures, or the oceans acidification that's creating, or what's happening to fisheries, to aquaculture, forest loss, the domestication of land, i.e. more and more land brought into domestication, into use. And then overall that degradation of our planet's biosphere, our life support system. So out of that work, the Resilience Centre came up with the 9 planetary boundaries, the geophysical chemical boundaries, and plotted the overshoot that we've already got underway. Well, our biggest overshoot is down there at 7 o'clock, which is the biogeochemical flows, and that's phosphorus and nitrogen, entirely from our use of artificial fertilizers in the way we farm and grow food around the world. The next big overshoot is loss of genetic diversity, i.e. species loss. And then the other big ones are land system change about 9 and 10 o'clock, and then climate change at 12 or midnight. And those have got so much cooked into them, particularly climate change, that although if they are yet to overshoot that boundary, they are absolutely heading in that direction. So when we think about these huge global issues, it's always worth reminding ourselves about the personal impact. So this is a photograph of my wife, Lynn, and myself, and our daughter at the age of not quite 8 years old, when she was little and the Franz Josef Glacier was big, and that was in 1998. Last winter, Celeste, who now lives overseas, and her fiance were back here in New Zealand. And they sent us this photograph from the Franz Josef, and I immediately recognized the location, and I rushed off to get this other photograph. Indeed, they are standing, Celeste is standing pretty much where she stood, just barely 20 years before. And that's how much ice has been lost from the Franz Josef. Our southern glaciers have lost about 1/3 of their ice mass. Jim Salinger, a climate change scientist, one of my great friends, tells me, and he's for decades has been involved in that, annual ice inventory down in the Southern Alps. So these things we think may be coming, or they're not moving fast, or they won't have much impact. But I think it's really important to remind ourselves how intense this is and how fast it's speeding up. So with that as a background, I want to talk briefly about the virus. I then want to talk about our economy, and then I want to talk about justice, particularly in those two crucial areas of inequality and climate justice. Two very crucial areas of injustice, because if we're going to address all these issues, people need to have the wherewithal, the sense of being a fully valued member of the community, and having the skills, the education, a reasonable standard of living, so they feel that they have that they can contribute the maximum of their skills and energies to all this. So that's why I'm focusing on those two inequalities, because ultimately this deep, deep unsustainability of our relationship with the planet is at the heart of so much of this. So the virus itself. This is a snapshot from the Johns Hopkins world map, and you'll see down the bottom left-hand corner, that was only on August the 8th, which is the last time I took a screenshot of it, until today. And in that time, since August the 8th, so just barely 2.5 weeks or so, the global cases, top left-hand, have gone from 19.4 to 23.6 million. And the global deaths over there towards the top right have increased by about 100,000 over that time. We have done extraordinarily well in New Zealand in terms of how we've coped with the crisis. So these are comparative death rates in terms of deaths per million of population. And I'll show you the exact numbers in a moment, but that gives you an idea of the spread across OECD countries. Now, if you're looking for a handy one-stop shop for a very good overview of where we're at with COVID, I can recommend this blog from the public health academics at the University of Otago. It is dated July 22nd. Things have moved on in the last month, but the judgments and much of the data is still very valid. So when we describe our goal of elimination, that doesn't mean eradicating the virus altogether, but it's defined worldwide as 28 days or more with no community transmission. And indeed, we did set a bit of a record for that of 102 days before our current outbreak. Even Iceland, which is the closest second to us, hasn't had a performance like that. Let me go back to those deaths. We had 22 actual deaths in New Zealand, but if our deaths were at the same rate as only the average for other developed countries, it would be 990. And if we'd had deaths at the same rate as Belgium, the worst in the OECD, we would have had 4,200 deaths. So again, I go back to that on a per million of population basis. We also did well in terms of reported cases per million of population, the third lowest in the OECD. But as of the late data in late July, our testing was only down around 10th in the OECD. We've accelerated that a lot over the last 10 days with the current upflare in cases. But it just goes to show that, yes, of course, testing and tracking are really important, but it's about how you deal across the whole of the suite of responses to the virus, which is important in terms of getting you down to that low reported level of cases and very, very low levels of death. As these academics, excellent people like Michael Baker were saying, essentially we've still got 5 things to do. We need to further strengthen border controls and quarantine, and we've made good progress on that over the last 10 days, having come uncomfortably close, scarily close really, to having community transmission run away from us, as it had done in Victoria, in Melbourne, once those border controls had been breached. And to upgrade the alert level system. So indeed now, at least on public transport, we've got some mandatory mask wearing. We've got to do an awful lot on upgrading our digital technologies, so to improve our tracking and tracing. And we've got to constantly work to find other ways to do surveillance on COVID-19, such as testing for the virus at sewage treatment plants, which is what's happening from outside the centres where people with COVID are quarantined in isolation, for example. And then it's really important to review how we've done, and particularly to plan beyond the short term we're planning at the moment. So these academics were very much arguing for, and I totally agree with them, about an official inquiry and to make policy much more transparent to business. In addition, as a business journalist, I'm acutely aware of what's going on in the business sector. And there is a big push from some in business to rightly increase quarantine capacity at the border, and possibly, I'm in two minds about this, use the private sector to do that, and then allow many more people who are willing to come across the border in those controlled circumstances and to pay for it to come. I think that's a reasonable goal, but I'm certainly more cautious than some people in terms of how steadily we would need to increase that. And I think the rate would actually be quite slow. So factors in our success included relatively early border restrictions, certainly the most stringent border restrictions among high-income countries. There's a wonderful stringency index done by academics at Oxford. If you want to dive deeply into that, it's impressive. And then, of course, the frequency and quality of the communications, particularly from the Prime Minister and from the Director General of Health, Ashley Bloomfield. And then we've thankfully got political leadership that does believe in science, modelling and advice and following it closely. I hope that continues. And then being able to make rapid, decisive and cohesive decisions and actions in lockdown. And the academics believe that that has helped increase our social cohesion and trust in politicians, obviously taken a bit of a dent over the last 10 days, 2 weeks, because of the flare up here in Auckland. We're starting to see over the last few weeks, I'd have to say, a few cracks appearing in some people's willingness to adhere to the restrictions. One of the favorite other pieces of analysis I came across was this wonderful paper from a UK organization called the Centre for Economic Policy Research about women leaders in COVID. And they say that our findings show that COVID outcomes are systematically better than in countries led by women. And they analyze why that is and then use insights and behavioral studies and leadership studies to speculate on the sources of their differences as well as their implications. And that's all true, but it's not just a matter of gender. And I'm not picking on Sophie Wilnes, the Prime Minister of Belgium. I think she is a fine politician in many respects, but dealing with a deeply, deeply fractured society and government. She's running a coalition government with a very small coalition base and just rather grudging acceptance of other parties to let her get things done. So just having a female leader is not enough. It has to be a very good female leader and somebody who has a functioning civil society and political system to be able to work with. In terms of the economy, a little bit of perspective I think is important here, that thus far in human history, we've designed and run economies as perpetual motion machines. So even very modest slowdowns in economic activity are destructive and destabilizing. In the global financial crisis, economic activity in many countries only came back in what was called the Great Recession by 3, 4, and harder hit countries, 4 or 5% of GDP. But in our second quarter, we're still waiting for the data, it looks like our GDP, our economic activity, fell by about 15%. And to set that in perspective, during the Great Depression, our economy fell 17%, but over 2.5 years, not 3 months. So that's the speed with which this has hit. Other countries where they have done far worse on the epidemiology of this and the health issues have done much worse. The UK economy contracted 19% in the 3 months to May. The Eurozone 12% in the second quarter to June, and the US by 10% almost in the second quarter to June, or 33% at an annual rate, if they kept going at that second quarter rate. So the IMF has been looking at these constant downgrades of global growth. So their most recent full global economy forecast was back in June, due for an update soon, and that's now down 5%, but more than enough to create extreme tensions and significant damage in the global economy. Meanwhile, debt by governments is heading for heights not seen since just at the very end of the Second World War. Very different conditions now, of course, not the least of which is that interest rates are very, very low and the risk of inflation very low as well. And so we can cope with those high debt levels, particularly in New Zealand, where our debt is only going to peak at just under 60% of debt to GDP, which is where many countries started, well, were way back at 60% years ago. So we're seeing many countries heading off from the high 80s, 90% on up, way beyond 100% over these next few years. So even though our government is spending a lot of money to keep the economy going and to support people, this is absolutely manageable. I'm feeling very comfortable about that. I'm reluctant to talk about overall losses in the global economy because we're trying to get to a different pattern of economic activity in terms of growth and how we do things. So we're not doing so much damage to ecosystems and sustainability. But this again just gives you a sense of how big the hole is that we need to fill. Possibly a good 12 trillion US dollars overall around the world. Needless to say, lots of people are having some big thinks about all this. This is a technology view about being on the cusp of the fastest, deepest, most consequential transformation of human civilization history, all very breathless. But the Rethink X people are extremely good. And they did this work in June during the height of the first wave of the pandemic. And there's a lot of really good sense in this report. It's a good base document. For my money, it doesn't in any way stress anywhere nearly as centrally or fully the whole big task around the acknowledged climate change, and this technology will help on that, but they haven't really got their head around the utter deep unsustainability in all we do, not just in climate change issues. There is lots of good work coming out about how we, to use a phrase now well known, build back better. And this is from Oxford University's Smith School of Enterprise and Environment, a very excellent bunch of people. And this, this report's well worth reading, because although the data's moved on, thematically it's still very valid. COVID-19 has already triggered major shifts in individual behaviors, social practices, beliefs, the role of government in the economy, and relations between nations and international institutions. These shifts have occurred on remarkably rapid timescales. So that's where what we're dealing with now is quite different from the global financial crisis, equally, very big in other ways, or in a few ways, but COVID is really shaking all the foundations of our society. Now, the World Economic Forum has a big project underway called the Great Reset. There is an urgent need for global stakeholders to simultaneously managing the direct consequences of COVID-19 to improve the state of the world. Thus, there is this Great Reset initiative. It's easy to be cynical about the World Economic Forum, particularly about their Davos get-together in January every year. But the forum has been shifting enormously, particularly over, say, the last decade, and is doing very well researched work and doing a terrific job on building coalitions across very wide ranges of people, not just sort of a narrow business elite, but much more widely. And so I can thoroughly recommend its work. Now, unfortunately, you probably don't have a subscription to the Financial Times, and I'm going to refer to a number of pieces. But the Financial Times often has trial subscription rates. There was a time a couple of months ago it was down to $1 for a month. So keep your eye open for those if you want to check these out. One of my favorite people overall, and was a good colleague when I was at the FT many years ago, is Martin Wolf, their chief economics columnist. And I want to just pick up on a piece that actually goes back to late last year, in which he said it's clear then that those states in which the middle elements is large and strong, stronger if possible than the other two, the wealthy and the poor, together, or at any rate stronger than either of them alone, have every chance of having a well-run constitution. And that was Aristotle, he reminds us, about constitutional democracy. And Martin says that it's no coincidence, it's no accident that the US and the UK, long stable democracies, are today succumbing to demagoguery, and that they are the most unequal of high income countries. And this is a table, a chart that he used in that presentation, or that piece. And you can see this is household disposable income. This is not wealth inequality, it's income inequality. Wealth inequality is more extreme. And on this OECD data from 2016, we are the fourth most unequal society in terms of income, after the US, South Korea, and the UK. And that's something we don't remind ourselves of nearly enough. So Martin calls this rigged capitalism, and he has some wonderful prescriptions about how we might do that differently. I won't dive into his prescriptions, but I will come back to another prescription in a moment. There's really interesting stuff going on out there. So Just Capital is a US NGO, and it rates companies on how justly they pay and treat their workers and other things. The red line here is the highest scoring companies in their analysis, the top 20% of those companies, and the bottom is the lowest 20%. And this is how those companies have outperformed over the last year, just by a question of how fairly, on the measure of how fairly they are treating people. And then linking the two, Cristiana Figueres, that wonderful leader from Costa Rica on climate issues, again, is very articulate. I think this piece is actually free access, about the linkage between tackling COVID-19, the climate crisis, and inequality. During the height of the lockdown in the UK, this was the Trafalgar Square in front of the National Gallery, and this was an Extinction Rebellion protest where to get the correct social distancing, people just left pairs of shoes behind, which I thought was completely brilliant. COVID today, climate tomorrow, act now. Jonathan Porritt is a UK leader in all of this, and in recent years has been becoming a frequent visitor to New Zealand, and very involved in advising a number of major companies here and starting up the Aotearoa Circle with, now very sadly, the late Sir Rob Fenwick, which I'll come back to the Aotearoa Circle in a moment. Jonathan has just published this book, Hope in Hell, A Decade to Confront the Climate Emergency. And he's saying that we have literally a decade left in which we have authentic, grounded hope to be able to anchor everything we do to serve our families, friends, and future generations. But there's no alternative to commit to more radical political action, to get as many people as possible involved in campaigning activities just as soon as possible. And this is a big switch for him personally, to say, to bring such pressure to bear on our political system while we still have time, to shift from today's wholly inadequate incrementalism to full-on emergency response. The case for civil disobedience is now overwhelming. He stresses, of course, non-violent, as I and many of us would. But this is how urgent we need to be dealing with these issues. Now, we were going to have on Thursday a wonderful online discussion with Jonathan to launch his book here in New Zealand. But yesterday we rescheduled that for September the 24th. If you're interested in joining us on that day, on the PDF, do click on that link and you'll be able to register to join that session. Just briefly about how the economy's been tracking. This is small business revenue growth, so growing nicely and then plunging down to a loss of 40%. This is data from zero, then coming back up by June. And then this is how we compared with the UK, which is red, and Australia black. So although Australia's lockdown was not as tight as ours, and their economy didn't contract as much as ours, we have recovered faster. And that's even more true now that our flare-up in COVID cases is nothing compared with what they're dealing with in Victoria and to a lesser extent in New South Wales and Queensland. Similarly, picture on jobs lost over those peak impact, and by the end of June, much less damage in terms of jobs lost here than either Australia or the UK. In preparation for my presentation to the combined councils tomorrow, there was a wonderful newsletter they'd put out which showed these wonderful data on consumer spending in the Carterton district and the Masterton district and the South Wairarapa district, so I'm just getting something out of the way so I can read that, and then Wellington City. So in the Wairarapa, you've done a lot better than Wellington City, and indeed South Wairarapa has done better than Carterton or Masterton. So very interesting to see that pattern. And then this, I won't dwell on the detail here, I'll let you look back at the PDF later. Building consents have held up well, and the councils have been busy processing them. So good to see that continuing activity. But some observations and the worries though. Generally speaking, before this recent flare-up, businesses were back to similar levels of activity compared with pre-lockdown, of course, except for tourism and international education. I do take those very seriously. But now we've had our first flare-up and renewed community transmission. The unknowns multiply about how the virus will track from here, but how people will respond, both as individuals in society and then working with government, how the government will respond. Certainly there are some hidden weaknesses in business and our economy out there, and which I'm keeping a very careful eye on. as they emerge. And then, of course, the state of the global economy is really quite parlous as well. However, against that, I'm, as a business journalist, am very impressed by how New Zealand businesses have been coping. I did a series of long interviews with CEOs of some major organizations, 16 of them, during level 4 lockdown. And it was wonderful, these themes that came through. 3 of them were they acted with real foresight. They were making very rapid, iterative decisions in ways they never had before, making decisions based on their limited knowledge, knowing that conditions, data, the virus, the economy are all changing very fast and they'd have to make new decisions. But then through all this, maintaining some part of their thinking about how do we keep an eye on the future and make sure what we're learning now helps us in that. So that was, as I say, the 16 separate pieces, one for each company. And then that link down at the bottom is to a piece where I wrapped up half a dozen themes that came through. And that is free when you go to our website newsroom. And that will give you, I think, a good sense of how the best of New Zealand businesses have been responding. Back to climate change, we know that our commitment for 2030 is incompatible with keeping the rise in temperature down to 1.5 degrees. This is work from the Climate Action Tracker. And we know we've got these huge tasks ahead, starting down here at the bottom, and this long journey up to decarbonising our economy. I'm not going to dwell on detail, launch into prescriptions. I'm just going to put that on the table. But we've got some good things going. The Zero Carbon Act and a Climate Commission, and now an ETS that sets a genuine carbon price. These are all very big steps in that in the most recent term of government. But we still urgently need policies and programs to accelerate the decarbonation of the economy. Those framework legislative things are only that. They're important tools, but now we've got to use them. Let me give you an example of one thing that business is up to. I mentioned the Aotearoa Circle. This is senior leaders of large companies and some government agencies that are working on putting natural capital at the heart of everything we do in New Zealand, to make sure that we're not degrading, diminishing, destroying that, but we are giving that natural capital a chance to recover. Their first big project was around sustainable finance, and a very good report out last year. And the final report is due out later on this year. They're proposing really fundamental change to the way our financial system works, and real buy-in by people such as Matt Winneray from the Superannuation Fund and Karen Silk from Westpac. In terms of other thinking going on, there's the Aotearoa Circle, there's Sir Peter Gluckman's Koitu, the Centre for Informed Futures at the University of Auckland, various others down there. So lots of ideas bubbling away. One of those websites that I'm involved with is called A New New Zealand. This is one of the little quotes we've got from Simon Cooper, a wonderful journalist in the UK. The leading talent hubs of the past 25 years have mostly been dense, well-connected global cities with excellent restaurants and cultural offerings. The model is over for now. The new demand is for a safe haven from COVID-19. The ideal for many Westerners would be an English-speaking democracy with a developed economy, lots of space and nice weather, though not so hot that it catches fire in summer. Bring on New Zealand. The country's isolation has suddenly gone from historic disadvantage to unique selling point. So now let me come back to justice, because as I said earlier, of all the injustices we're trying to put right, The inequality in economic and income terms is a very big one, and then that climate injustice too. Now, these slides have lots of words on them. I'm not going to read all the words. I'm going to leave you to look back on the themes later, but let me just deal with a few overall thoughts. Branko Milanovic is a terrifically good and well-known economist for his work on global inequality, and he says it is utterly wrong to believe that history does not matter and the social and political changes wrought by the pandemic can be ignored. And that these political forces that have been set in motion will fundamentally affect how economies behave in the future. And one of the things he points out is that if governments around the world are easing up taxes on business to help them survive and to encourage new growth and startups, then they're going to have to ease up taxes on labor. In all fairness, you've got to find the money somewhere. Therefore, taxes on capital will have to rise to help fund recovery, create opportunities, and to help reduce inequality. So that's the nub of this really important issues, that when societies are unequal and they divide economically, they fall apart socially and culturally. And lockdown is exaggerating that, both in terms of the pressure it puts on people, but the suffering that is disproportionately greater for people in low-paid and insecure jobs. These are, in many cases, are essential workers that have to be out there working and being very poorly paid for it. And those are the people who've been losing the jobs around the world, not the wealthy. Many people are seeing the economy as a system to which they do not belong, and that they believe it's rigged to benefit others, which is where we get onto wealth taxes. Now, if we go back best part of 20 or 30 years, there were still quite a few countries in the OECD with wealth taxes, but now there are only 4 left, of which Belgium is a recent re-recruit. The whole political push against wealth taxes has been very effective over these decades. But I'm always fascinated by Switzerland, that's had a wealth tax. And there's this lovely quote from the finance director of the Swiss canton of Zug. He says a wealth tax is a perfectly adequate tax and a good system. And there is support for these around the world. I won't dwell on the data down below, but that's in the US, strong support for a wealth tax when it was proposed by Senator Warren when she was a candidate for the Democratic nomination for president. There's basically 2 strands of argument going on here. There are people like Piketty and Sayes and Zuckman, very good economists, who are dealing about the inherited or accumulated wealth causing unfairness and power inequality. So they're very much motivated by that for a new form of wealth tax. Whereas there is a same goal but different motives. So there is, and I'll show you this paper in a moment, an American economist and his colleagues, Fatih Guvinen, arguing that inherited or accumulated wealth is inefficient and unfair. And the longer it's accumulated and the older that capital is, the more conservative it becomes and more poorly deployed that capital is. But either way, both of these sort of strands of thinking believe that this tax need only be minor. 2 or 3% is absolutely optimal. I won't dwell on the Guvinen paper here. I'll leave you to look at it. But that bold comment there, wealth taxation can increase efficiency, grow the economy, and reduce inequality all at once. So this is a very, very different way than we were looking at health taxes historically. Hence, a very interesting group of economists have established a wealth tax study group in the UK just back last month, and this is their first paper that's come out of it. And in the UK, the average wealth per adult has quadrupled in constant pounds, but that's been since 1980, it has quadrupled, but that's very, very substantially skewed to a small part of the population. Now, this takes me on to another one of my favorite writers, and a younger generation than Martin Wolf, for example, Martin Sandbu, who has just published a terrific book called The Economics of Belonging. And he's trying to deal with this issue about economic insecurity triggering angst and culture and suspicion of outsiders, and the huge cultural and political divides. And he contrasts, for example, how Roosevelt dealt with the Great Depression versus Hitler, and of course then taking us into war. Now, I won't dwell on this, but he's got 5 big themes. I'm not going to go through them about how you bring about this economics of belonging. And then here are some pieces that fill out his work on wealth taxes and the book itself. I'm very excited about this book. I think it's a very substantial step forward. Here in New Zealand, the Green Party, of course, has recommended a guaranteed minimum income, funded in large part by a wealth tax. And this has generated all the usual responses about how ridiculously difficult wealth taxes are to deploy, and they're very unfair and everything else. And I must say I was rather disappointed that John McDermott, who until relatively recently was chief economist of the Reserve Bank and still does great work at Motu public policy research in Wellington, wrote a recent article that indulged in just a thought experiment. It wasn't analysis about how if you had a 2% wealth tax, it would increase tax revenue by about 2%, but GDP would fall, and business environment would weaken, and so would demand for labor. And I'm afraid this is just completely out of step with the modern and current work going on in some quarters overseas, not here, about wealth taxes. And then just to round this out, I want to offer you one last thought, and this is going back to the day of climate strike around the country on September the 20th. We had a pretty good turnout in Wellington too. So in total, that day, 170,000 people marched, and it was reckoned to be our second largest public protest. And about almost 4% of New Zealand's population were out protesting that day. And that turns out to be a very significant number, because it looks as though from research that about 3.5% is the threshold at which protests successfully trigger big social and political changes which transform societies. And this is the work of a Harvard professor, Erica Chenoweth, based on her analysis of 323 long-running mass actions in countries around the world, 1900 and 2006. And the non-violent ones were by far the most successful versus violent, getting to the point of civil war. It's a fabulous study. That's a link to a paper by her on her continuing work, and a very good TEDx talk. So I'm going to leave it at that point now and just leave you with this wonderful quote. I'm sure it'll turn up big enough on your screen for you to read, and I will leave the last words to Rachel Carson.